Virginia Tech for sponsoring the event. And many thanks to the Virginia Tech University community and others who have joined us from around the country and the world. I wish I could be there, though, in Blacksburg with you in person, maybe one day. In the past 10 days, we've witnessed remotely 2 mass shootings that have taken 18 lives. I will speak to the unique to the United States mass shootings. But first, I want to embed the present into the history that has created the phenomena of gun fetish and violence in the United States, and the central role of the Second Amendment in the rise of the white nationalist movement during the past half century. When the British colonies declared their independence in 1776, they declared themselves as states, 13 states, and wrote state constitutions. Several included gun rights, but Virginia's constitution stood out as definitive, reading, "No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms." 15 years later, just after the Constitution was approved, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. The right to bear arms was listed second only to freedom of speech, reading, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The National Rifle Association and its constituency argue that the Second Amendment guarantees the right for every individual to bear arms, while gun control advocates maintain that the Second Amendment is about states continuing to have their own militias, emphasizing the language of well-regulated, and that this is manifest in the existing states' National Guards. However, the respective state militias that came to be called National Guards were already authorized by the US Constitution when the amendment was added. The Constitution recognized the existing colonial, now state militias that formed before and during the War for Independence, and mandated to them vital roles to play, quoting the Constitution, "to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasion." That's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution. And further, that the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of the state militias when called into actual service of the United States. So that has absolutely nothing to do with the Second Amendment. Given that what are now states' National Guards are descended from state militias, which themselves were repurposed from colonial militias, why was the Second Amendment added as one of the enumerated rights of man in the Bill of Rights, unique in the world to this day? Unequivocally, the Second Amendment, along with the other 9 amendments, constitute individual rights, and the militias referenced are voluntary, not state militias. They're white citizens' militias. The well-organized part, they were very well-organized, white settlers, in taking native land. One argument that runs through the historical accounts of the thinking behind the Second Amendment is that idealized Anglo settlers were fiercely independent and fearing Big Brother government, demanding settlers' rights to overthrow oppressive regimes. But what settlers considered oppressive was any restriction that authorities put on them in regard to obtaining land, which they equated with liberty. The settlers' complaint and the reason for the colonies seeking independence was Britain's decision in the mid-1700s to halt further settler expansion beyond the 13 colonies, forbidding settlers from seizing native lands peripheral to the colonies in the Appalachians and beyond, because it could lead to unnecessary and expensive wars with the by then very well organized and armed indigenous inhabitants who had been ethnically cleansed from the 13 colonies, but were still in existence and joined with the Shawnee and others nearby. And once the United States was established, white settlers never had problems. They don't to this day with government, as long as they are not restrained, especially from taking land and their privileges as white settlers. Historian Charles Sellers wrote, "Cheap land held absolutely under the seaboard market's capitalist conception of property swelled patriarchal honor to heroic dimensions in rural America. The father's authority rested on his legal title to the family land. Where European peasant land holdings were usually encumbered with obligations to some elite, the American farmer held in fee simple. Supreme in his domain, he was beyond interference by any earthly power. He owed no obligations of labor, money, service, or religious fealty to any person or entity. Fee simple land, the augmenting theater of the patriarchal persona, sustained his honor and untrammeled will. This extraordinary independence inflated American settlers' conception of their class far above peasantry. These settlers razed and destroyed indigenous villages and fields, killed women and children, raided settlements for captives, intimidating and brutalizing unarmed indigenous farmers and their families, assassinating indigenous town leaders. Unlimited US wars against Native nations remained a near constant throughout the first 100 years of US existence. This blood-soaked aggression cast natives as savages, with the Anglo settlers as victims. The US Army and white settler militias jackbooted across the continent to the Pacific, ethnically cleansing the continent west of the Mississippi by forcibly removing Native peoples, ending only when surviving natives were herded into military guarded concentration camps. Settler militias and armed households were initiated for the destruction and control of Native peoples, communities, and nations. With the expansion of plantation agriculture worked by enslaved Africans, by the late 1600s, they were also used as slave patrols, forming the basis of the US police culture after slavery was abolished. That is the inseparable other half of the settler-colonial reality that is implicit in the Second Amendment. The first enslaved Africans to be shipped to the British first colony of the eventual 13 colonies that became the United States took place in 1619 when 20 bonded Africans arrived held in chains by the merchant ship in Virginia and were purchased by the tobacco planters who by then had driven the indigenous inhabitants out of the coastal area. The original Bill of Rights for individual citizens was added to the completed US Constitution. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, is the most revered and is considered an attribute of US exceptionalism. But far more exceptional is the Second Amendment. It was drafted by James Madison and added to the US Constitution in 1781. But little attention was paid to the Second Amendment until it became controversial during the second half of the 20th century, and it continues coinciding with political, social, and economic shifts that opened nearly everything to question in the 1960s, particularly segregation and anti-Black racism. Then in the 1970s and 1980s, some white men, increasingly buttressed by the National Rifle Association, began pointing to the Second Amendment as an absolute right for the individual to bear arms and its justification for limiting firearms regulation, raising gun ownership as a constitutional issue, a covenant matter. On the National Rifle Association's website, every possible argument for gun control is contested based on the exact wording of the Second Amendment, in part by quoting the sacred founding fathers. George Mason asked, "Who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people." Thomas Jefferson said, "No free man shall be debarred the use of arms." Patrick Henry said, "The great object is that every man be armed." Richard Henry Lee wrote that to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms. Thomas Paine noted that arms discourage and keep the invader and the plunderer in awe and preserve order in the world, as well as preserving property. Samuel Adams warned, "The said Constitution must never be construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms." Up to the 1960s, there had been little juridical attention paid to the Second Amendment, and it was not held to be sacrosanct by anyone. No one talked about it. Its mandate being taken for granted. But at the end of World War II, the US social, economic, and political order was solidly and confidently a white patriarchal Protestant republic, dominated by corporations run by white men, with worldwide investments and financial reserves, along with a massive military machine, far greater than any country in the world. Unionization movements, primarily made up of white workers, were seduced by home ownership and middle-class status, their unions becoming business-oriented and their own profit-making privatized healthcare. While the United Kingdom and Western European states responded to militant union demands to institute universal public health care and nationalization of railroads, electricity and gas, and other essential services. Black descendants after World War II, right after, were still Black descendants of enslaved Africans still lived under totalitarian Jim Crow in the former Confederate states and were ghettoized and discriminated against when they escaped the South in migrations for northern and coastal industrial urban areas that were stalked by urban police forces resembling slave patrols. Native Americans were abandoned on shrunken land bases that could not support life, forcing many to work in nearby or faraway cities, while Congress began reversing New Deal reforms that acknowledged the native land base and governments, culminating in congressional imposition of termination of native status and land bases in 1953, an erasure that took the Red Power movement 2 decades to reverse. On the other hand, Irish and Central, Southern, and Eastern Europeans, mainly being Catholics and Jews, had made gains in being accepted as equal, that is, as white. On the West Coast, US citizens of Chinese and Mexican descent were discriminated against and subject to deportation, while US citizens of Japanese descent had been incarcerated in concentration camps, stripped of their property and citizenship rights. Want ads for jobs segregated men and women, as well as white and Black, with lower wages for women and Black workers. Ivy League universities were overwhelmingly white and for men only, Anglo men, with quotas to limit the number of Jewish men, and of course, Black people. The explosion that cracked the white republic was the 1954 US Supreme Court school desegregation decision under Chief Justice Earl Warren, ironically, who was the wartime Attorney General of California, who facilitated rounding up Japanese Americans for federal incarceration. Based on decades of organizing for African American desegregation, the order for school desegregation was a great achievement for the civil rights movement, but the backlash commenced immediately. White citizens' councils organized all over the United States, linking racial integration with communism and labeling it un-American. Anti-communism was always anti-Black racism. Within 3 years of the Supreme Court desegregation decision, the white nationalist John Birch Society was launched by Robert Welch, the heir of the Welch candy fortune in Massachusetts, along with others such as fossil fuel magnate Fred Koch, father of the Koch brothers, who in the 21st century fund legislation and movements to end all government benefits and the privatization of public goods. The Supreme Court composition was the target of this white nationalist movement, their slogan being, "Impeach Earl Warren," the Supreme Court Chief Justice, using the Republican Party as the vehicle, and had largely achieved their goals with the Trump administration's appointment of 3 justices, shifting the ideological spectrum to 5 ultra-conservative justices, 1 moderate conservative, and 3 liberal ones. The promise of permanent progress was the context within which the Black civil rights movement grew and contributed momentum to other ongoing movements for liberation, including Puerto Rican independence movement, Native American self-determination, as well as the Mexican farm worker unionization of the 1960s, the Chicano movement, women's and LGBTQ rights, and the rising student anti-imperialist and anti-war movements that grew in opposition to the accelerating US war to overthrow the government of Vietnam. The counter-revolution against these advances brought Richard Nixon, then Ronald Reagan, to the presidency. By 1990, capitalism and militarism were triumphant in dissolving the Eastern European socialist bloc and organized liberation movements that had taken power in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, which became shadows of their former aspirations. The first highly visible sign of a well-organized counter-revolution inside the United States vying for political power was the evangelical anti-abortion mass movement that soared following the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision to decriminalize abortion in 1972. And significantly, the relatively benign century-old National Rifle Association was taken over by the Second Amendment Foundation, a white nationalist organization that had been founded in 1974 by Harlan Carter, who had been the border chief of the 1950s mass deportation of Mexicans in Operation Wetback, many of them US citizens. Harlan Carter then was elected president of the NRA. This is the moment when the Second Amendment became a white nationalist cause, relying on the right-wing ideology of originalism, that is, interpreting the original meaning of the US Constitution, or the perceived original meaning. After slaughtering and maiming millions of Vietnamese, the US military was driven out of Vietnam in total defeat in 1975, leaving many of the nearly 3 million US combat troops who had served in the war mentally and physically scarred, many left homeless and drug addicted, as well as being conceived as losers. The ranks of white nationalist groupings were filled with Vietnam veterans. And social movements were crushed. Parallel to post-war liberation movements, the US Central Intelligence Agency ran counterinsurgent operations against national liberation movements before and after they took power in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, Asia, and Africa. While J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation ran similar operations against domestic movements, including COINTELPRO, a domestic counterintelligence program that criminalized and crushed the student anti-war movement, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, among other organizations. Anti-communism was the connective tissue until the socialist bloc collapsed in 1990, although anti-communism remains a social and political weapon of control domestically and internationally. White nationalist groupings multiplied in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. Mass shootings began in the 1970s and came to be happen quite frequently. Gun sales soared. In 2008, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision, District of Columbia versus Heller, that held that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess and carry firearms. The late Justice Antonin Scalia writing for the majority. For the first time, the Supreme Court, the ultimate interpreter of the meaning of the US Constitution, decided that the Second Amendment means the individual when it says people. However, the decision left open the issue of government regulations. In the decision was written, nothing, in our opinion, should be taken to cast doubt on longstanding prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. A Gallup poll, that, by the way, the bill that's before Congress right now that the House of Representatives passed with no support from the Republicans and is probably going to fail because of the filibuster, makes only those prohibitions plus, the ban on automatic weapons being sold to civilians. A Gallup poll released soon after the Heller decision found that 73% of those polled, a far larger percentage than the 30% of gun owners in the United States or the 3 million National Rifle Association members, 73% believe that the Second Amendment guarantees individual gun rights, while 20% believed it only guarantees the right of state militia members. Only 7% had no opinion. But overwhelmingly, US citizens, not only white men or the NRA, accept the notion of the sanctity associated with the Second Amendment. Today, there are around 350 million firearms. No one knows for sure because those are only the ones that are registered, that are privately owned by individuals. This is equal to the population of the United States, like one gun per person. However, only 30% of the population owns even one firearm. And those who do own a firearm, average 8 firearms each. It's not unusual. I know quite a few people in Oklahoma that have 30, 40 firearms in their homes. 74% of gun owners in the US are male, and 82% of gun owners are white, which means that 61% of adults who own guns are white men. And this group accounts for 31% of the total US population. The top reason they give for owning a gun, they say, is for protection. So what are the majority of white men so afraid of? The core group of these white male multiple gun owners are descendants of the original white settlers who are white supremacists and white nationalists. We saw them on television during the past 6 years at Trump's stadium rallies that began in 2015. We saw them shadowing the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, and their armed appearances all last year at state capitals and civic centers, protesting masking and sheltering in place restrictions. And we saw them on January 6th at the US Capitol building. They are not invisible, and they are armed to the teeth. During the same period that white nationalism and Second Amendment fetishism were rising in the 1970s, mass shootings began, mainly in workplaces, then schools, then everywhere. Assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert and Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1960s seemed a prelude, as was the first mass shooting that took place in 1966, when Charles Whitman, former Marine, went to the top of the University of Texas tower and sniped and killed 13, wounded 31 others before being shot by police. 20 years later, it's 20 years later until the pattern actually began and has not ended since, with the post office killings in the quiet town of Edmond, Oklahoma, a few miles from where I grew up and where my aunt had just left the post office, followed by dozens other post office mass shootings, giving rise to the new term going postal It happened at a time at the time of the Reagan era deindustrialization and downsizing of privatizing public goods. Other workplace mass shootings followed. More recently, school shootings have prevailed, some 30 incidents since Columbine in 1989. And as we have seen in the past 10 days, mass shootings continue unabated. Although most of the mass shooters have been white males, few of these events have been carried out by white nationalists, and those few have been loners, maybe losers too, but such as the one in Atlanta last week targeting Asian Americans, but not associated with any white nationalist group. I studied the profiles of all of these mass shooters. Only the ones that there's so many, only the ones that the death toll is over 10. And I found, I believe, the connective tissue to be pretty logically mental illness, or not necessarily, it can be a passing mental illness, isolation, the lack of adequate mental health care in the United States, along with the proliferation of firearms and easy, instant legal acquisition. But far more common than mass shootings, the equally tragic fact of gun suicides that take thousands of lives each year, something like 60,000, which is double the rate that it used to be before widespread gun proliferation after the 1960s. Half of all suicide attempts by other means other than guns is unsuccessful or interrupted, but with a gun, it's final. Same with domestic violence, has shot up tremendously with guns being available. One thing to be beaten and bruised to a pulp, for a woman to have that experience, but with a gun nearby, it's final. As I'm sure you're aware, most of you are aware, those of you in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech, 14 years ago, a mass shooting happened at Virginia Tech, one of the few in which the shooter was a person of color, and probably the most interesting in terms of his expressed motive. On April 16, 2007, a new record was set for mass shootings with 32 dead and 23 wounded on the Virginia Tech University campus in Blacksburg, Virginia. The shooter was 23-year-old senior Sungham Cho, using Glock 19 and Walther P22 pistols. And he carried magazines stocked with 400 rounds of ammunition, all acquired legally. The Virginia Tech shootings were described in 2007 as the worst mass killing, the worst massacre in US history. That number as the worst did not last. In 2016, 50 young people were slaughtered in a mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and 60 were shot by a gunman in the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas. That is the worst of those mass shootings of that type. Up to now, it's probably going to be overcome at some point. Dozens of other mass shootings killed 10 or more in between the extremes. Perhaps the most shocking was the mass shooting of 28 kindergarten children at a school in Connecticut in December 2012. Whatever the numbers, Descendants of massacred indigenous ancestors take exception to the counts. Joan Redfern, who is Lakota, expressed the reaction of many, saying, "To say the Virginia shooting is the worst in all of US history is to pour salt on old wounds. It means erasing and forgetting all of our ancestors who were killed in the past." She was not referring to US Army massacres specifically, rather white citizens' militias that are provided for in the Second Amendment. However, refugee survivors in the United States from Southeast Asia and Korea might wince at the outpouring of grief for the numbers killed in mass shootings when they recall the 5 million of their brethren killed by US bombs and massacres. This undoubtedly was Cho's reference point. When Cho went on his killing spree, there was a great deal of news about the federally financed and sponsored 400-year commemoration of the founding of Jamestown, especially in Virginia. Highly publicized planning for which had been going on for a year before that April and the shooting. Was Cho curious enough to do a search on the internet about Jamestown? Maybe the FBI knows from studying Joe's hard drive, but they most likely would not get it. Or maybe Cho just looked at a book or had a history course. Perhaps he saw some pictures of drawings of the Powhatan indigenous people who were killed by the British mercenary Captain John Smith and his militia. Perhaps Cho saw a reflection of his own features in those Powhatan faces and was reminded of what had happened to his own people, the multiple massacres of Korean civilians in the 1950s US invasion and occupation of his parents' homeland. The occupation and humiliation continuing today. I recall stories from Native American and Mexican veterans returning from Vietnam saying how they could not bring themselves to shoot when they could see the faces of the people who looked like their relatives. Much was made in the press about Cho being Asian, then specifically Korean, surely touching on those mystic chords of memory of Yellow Peril and Asian wars lost by the United States or not won militarily. Yet there was nothing in the press about the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and the ongoing US military presence and war games. Uncountable millions of Korean civilians were killed in that war, many in US military massacres of refugees. Millions of children were left without parents. Cho was not a child of those Korean War orphans stolen by US religious groups, children who grew up in white middle American communities, not knowing their real names or birth dates or families or villages. Cho's parents had immigrated in 1992 when he was 8 years old, settling in a Virginia suburb of Washington, D.C., where they started a dry cleaning business, sending Cho and his older sister to the best schools. His sister was at Princeton. That may sound like the American dream realized, but only if one has never taken notice of the toxic, backbreaking work involved in a family-owned and run dry cleaning operation with immigrant parents, mostly Asian, working themselves to death so their children might have a crack at the American dream. Cho and his sister were beneficiaries of their parents' labor to pay for their elite educations. It was curious to watch the media circus on television, which I followed very closely, so I was going to write about it. surrounding the Jamestown celebration, and with Queen Elizabeth herself and President George W. Bush presiding, the journalists failed to compare or at least think about the colonial massacres of the Powhatans 4 centuries earlier and that single disturbed individual shooting of his classmates 4 hours away. Cho appeared to be overwhelmed by wealthy white students who made up 75% of the undergraduate student body. As an Asian American, he undoubtedly was stung by anti-Asian bigotry. In his videotape manifesto Cho made and sent to the press before his rampage, he called his fellow students sadistic snobs and said further, "You have never felt a single ounce of pain in your whole life. Did you want to inject as much misery in our lives as you can, just because you can? You had everything you wanted. Your Mercedes was not enough, you brats. Your golden necklaces were not enough, you snobs. Your trust fund was not enough. Your vodka and cognac weren't enough. All your debaucheries weren't enough. Those weren't enough to fulfill your hedonistic needs. You had everything." And he stated in his video, "I die like Jesus Christ to inspire generations of the weak and defenseless people." In light of the anti-Asian hatred and abuse that dates back to the first arrival of Chinese due to the US in 1850 and the US Exclusion Act of 1882, soon extended to all Asians, Cho's words resonate. Some say that any time or effort spent trying to understand a mass killer does a disservice to the victims and their families. But whose interest is served by shutting down discussion of motives and circumstances, and particularly the history behind it? One is not alleging lack of criminal intent or behavior, but what made it possible. Wouldn't it be appropriate to at least acknowledge the pathological celebration of colonization and genocide in Virginia at the time of the shootings, as well as virulent anti-Asian bigotry as playing a role in Cho's decision? Each mass killing is followed by an orgiastic chorus of proclamations about a bubble of normality that's been punctured by a sole evildoer. Perhaps the incidents play a role in US society somewhat as Dostoevsky had his character, the idiot, play as the member of the family who's weird or evil, so that the rest of the family can be perceive themselves as normal. With the suppression of discussion of a settler-colonial society built on genocide and all the anger and tension we experience and observe daily, with endless US wars killing millions of people, and with the easy availability of firearms, it's a wonder mass killings don't happen more often. But maybe the mass killer speaks for many and is a preventative. A false normality settles in, the evildoer punished for his crime until the next one. I want to end with a poem by Indigenous poet Sherman Alexie, a citizen of the Spokane Nation in the Pacific Northwest. So if ever built, what will the United States Native American Genocide Memorial Museum contain? What will it exhibit? It will be one room, a 50-foot square with the same large photo filling the walls, ceilings, and floor. There will be only one visitor allowed at any one time. There will be no furniture. That one visitor will have to stand or sit on the floor or lie on the floor if they feel the need. The visitor must remain in that room for 1 hour. There will be no music. The only soundtrack will be random gunshots from rifles used throughout American history. Reverberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very moving presentation. I'm going to start off with some questions. We have a couple here coming in from the audience, and I'm going to send some of my own. But before we get to that, I wanted to make sure to thank Dr. Jessica Taylor, who is the Director of Public History at Virginia Tech, for making this event possible. Funding from Public History made this all possible here via Zoom, and also to Melissa Faircloth, the Director of the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center here at Virginia Tech as well. And with that, we can now move over to question and answers here. So one of the first questions that I'd like to throw out at you is this question of potentially arming more people. Or, you know, there's two big groups I've seen that tend to call for this more. So we have people on the left saying, you know, gun culture is something that belongs to the conservatives, it belongs to the right. More liberals should be arming themselves. So something like Redneck Riot and the Socialist Rifle Association. And then you also have people of color, Black people, Native people, Latinx people that are also calling for the same thing. You know, guns have been used against our people. We should start arming ourselves legally as well. So what are your thoughts on this, on these ideas? Do you think they're good ideas? Do you think they're bad ideas? Just general thoughts, I suppose.
More guns, just what we need in the United States. Well, you know, there's a logical premise to it. I don't really, I'm not really a supporter of gun control laws because I think they make no difference whatsoever. I think there's a much deeper cause of gun violence that laws will not and have not changed. I researched the assertion that I hear all the time right now too, that the ban on automatic weapons back in the Clinton administration actually lowered the use of those weapons, and it's just not true. It had no effect whatsoever. The shootings continued, and of course the wars continued. So, you know, there is a for one thing, the junior ROTC, aided by the NRA, are in, you know, every school, middle schools and high schools all over this country. So I don't think more guns are the solution. For one thing, several things. One is the groups I know, the DSA, the socialist groups, the Native American, the Black Panthers, and their progeny today, and others call for self-defense. They don't call for arming for, you know, like white nationalists. They have the right to self-defense. The only thing is, and they certainly have the right to self-defense, but they really should take Taekwondo, because honestly, a firearm is not a self-defense weapon. Your legs and arms are, but not a firearm. A firearm is made for one thing, and that is to shoot and kill, and shoot first. It's simply not a self-defense weapon. So I think that's the, you know, that's the delusion of power. One feels in power with a gun. I went through my gun stage. I tell about it in Loaded. And what we found, our group, who, for very good self-defense reasons, we were being hounded in New Orleans, hounded by the Ku Klux Klan. by the way, David Duke himself, when he was a young man, by the New Orleans Red Squad police, by random white nationalists, by everyone. And we decided to get a shotgun, to guard the place, take turns guarding the place. And then we got other weapons, we felt we needed to, since there were no gun laws in Louisiana, that we needed, and you didn't have to register a gun, that we got sidearms that we could carry around for self-protection. And we found ourselves, of course, New Orleans, southern Louisiana is a very humid place, to say the least. And the guns could rust very easily. So we found ourselves, instead of out organizing in the streets, which we had been doing for 2 years, we were sitting around in our place, oiling and cleaning the guns constantly. They became, like pets or babies, like infants, delicate little things. The other thing is that firearms, especially, the ones that people want, the cool ones, the Walthers, the Glocks, they are beautiful objects, and they're very, very addictive because they are empowering, but it's a false sense of power. So I think it's a mistake to, for those reasons. And I think it's actually, the original desire for self-defense, or even collective self-defense, using firearms, is a perfectly legitimate motive. That then what happens with the training, with the constant handling of these guns, what happens, what I went through and have seen other people go through, making the guns very central then to your life and organizing. So I think it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous to get a gun, to even to even look at a gun. I really admire the Asian American groups right now who are forming their own guards in San Francisco and other cities, in Oakland, completely unarmed, only with a cell phone. And it's very effective. And I would like to see that, in other communities as well, because I do think communities of color are under constant danger. And of course, a gun, if the police are involved, a gun, immediately you become a felon instead of just someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Great.
I mean, others are perfectly, in the discussion to bring this up again and challenge me if you wish.
Sure. Yeah, we'll see if anything pops up here. I do think you bring some great points up that depending on how much time we have, I'll try to hit on some more, especially the assault weapon ban. So let me go to another question here. This is sent from a viewer. In retrospect, would the Virginia Tech shooter be considered an incel/misogyny motivated shooting? He expressed rage at women on campus for being the S word if they were sexually active. He tried to dominate and control Nikki Giovanni in class, really resent the institution that Virginia Tech shooter was justified. And we have another question that is very similar also about mass shooters tend to have some type of run-ins with authorities related to violence against women. So I guess kind of just in general, how does violence against women link up with gun violence? And in particular here, this question that I first read, particularly with Virginia Tech.
Yeah, it might, that may be that certainly is the case in some cases, but and they are male, and I talked about the origins of that patriarchy in the United States. But in my study, the profiles of these mass shooters, I'm always on the alert for anything that's anti-woman, anti-feminist, being a feminist, but I don't find that as a central issue. I know it's come up in the Atlanta case as seems like a way of not admitting to anti-Asian bigotry more than anything, but um, there is enormous, certainly the anti-Asian women aspect is Asian women have for centuries been exoticized and sexualized by Western men, and all those wars of the United States only turning many women into sex workers certainly propelled that too. But I haven't necessarily found that in most of the cases. Of course, some of these people are very, very young men, like the young man at the Sandy Hook, killed the kindergarten kids. He himself had been, had gone to that school and was only 19. But in that case, it's interesting, the woman's role, his mother, a quite wealthy woman from Maine who had moved down there, divorced her husband. She had a very large house and it was filled with guns. She was a gun freak, but in that very, high society way. She went to the gun range all the time. She had, these are the weapons he used. She didn't keep them locked up, and he was on the autistic somewhere in that
spectrum.
he had been diagnosed with autism, and she thought the good therapy for him was to take him to the shooting range. So by the time he was 16, he was a professional level shooter. And so what he did that day, and no one knows what guided him, but he first of all shot his mother and then went and shot those little kids with her guns. So, these profiles are they're so complex that I think it's a little bit too easy just to say they're all misogynist and I just don't think that's the case with the 100 or so that I've looked at.
Great. Here's another question that's somewhat related as well, is how do you see the epidemic of mass violence in North America intersecting with the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis?
Well, I'm not sure there's an intersection of that, but there's certainly in both Canada and the United States, and I would say in Latin America too, in these settler-colonial situations, the degradation of women in any colonial situation, the sexualization, as I spoke of about Asian women, is it leads to objectifying these women as simply being sex objects and worthless and all. But I think the main thing is in this case is that they know there's no cost to it because they never get caught. And that, at least in the United States, is and why Republicans are so opposed to the Violence Against Women Act is because when it was renewed last time, Native women had done lobbying and succeeded in getting it to be slightly revised to include Native women. And this mainly came from, interestingly enough, from Louise Erdrich, a Anishinaabe writer from North Dakota, writing The Roundhouse, a wonderful novel that deals with, you know, this real life situation of these murdered women. Because on the reservation in the 1880s, the United States Congress legislated the end to the right of Native people to police their reservations. They can have tribal police, but they cannot arrest a non-Indian person in their territory to this. And so what it did was restore police power for Native American nations in the United States. Because this just puts up a green light flashing, you know, for any predator to go in and know they can rape any number of young women they wish, and absolutely no consequences whatsoever. So that's why Republicans oppose the Violence Against Women Act. They were all for it before, you know, they put in Native sovereignty. But restoring any level of Native sovereignty is not something they can accept. So it's actually being fought out in the Senate. So so this is, you know, it is a serious problem. Deb Haaland, when she was senator, one of the first things she did as senator was have a hearing on this issue of missing and violated Native women. I'm not so sure about Canada. I know that they don't have the police power. They have, you know, kind of some very different arrangements, but I think still in, you know, the reservation areas, white men can get by with murder. In the Amazon, I recall back in 1977 when we were doing a international conference on Indigenous people in Geneva, that we were not, that the Brazilian representatives of the Yanomami who were supposed to come were barred from coming because they weren't allowed to have passports. And then we learned that Yanomami was killed in 1980, and we were trying to, you know, get to the bottom of it, why he was killed. And the white man, Brazilian, who did the murder, was on trial, and he was acquitted because even though a law had been made in 1979 that it was actually a crime to kill an Indian for the first time in Brazilian history. But he was acquitted because he said he didn't know about the law. So this is the level of, you know, lack of any kind of legal protection for Native people.
Great. We have another question here. Do you think that Native Americans gaining a hold of guns was a good thing? Did it even the field with white nationalists taking land, or did it lead to just more senseless killings?
Well, absolutely. When war in a state of war, it's all about weapons. Native people in the 13 colonies in that period of time from 1607 and Jamestown to then the Puritans, Native people, I know that in history books you will read Native people were always warring with each other, but actually they weren't. They solved most of their differences by diplomacy. Sometimes there were conflicts, but they certainly were not all warring with each other. They were 99% of the Native people in North America and the whole hemisphere were farmers. The greatest farmers in the world that produced almost everything we eat today, were taken from native agriculture. So they were not armed people, and they were slaughtered. They were absolutely slaughtered by the likes of John Smith and other mercenaries. These are people who were fighting the Crusades, fighting Muslims in Turkey. John Smith, Captain John Smith, they were killers, murderers, and they appropriated the oyster beds and the farms of the native people by starving them out. So they couldn't kill everyone. They forced people out. They killed a lot of people, but they forced them out. So they were taken in by other native nations, like the Tuscarora in North Carolina, were taken in by the Haudenosaunee in upstate New York, who still hadn't been touched and were not until after the U.S. Independence. Took them in as another nation. There were 5 nations of the Iroquois, and they became the 6th nation, the Tuscarora. So tribes took them in. They also marooned, like in the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina, in the Everglades, and escaped enslaved Africans, also marooned with them. So they didn't, they were still there, and they were still fighting on the periphery and trying to prevent further expansion. But of course, they armed themselves, and across the continent, they fought back. But these were wars of self-defense, true self-defense.
Great. And here we have what'll probably be our last question as we wrap up the event. As someone who does not know the history of the NRA, can you discuss more about the takeover by the Second Amendment organization? Was it a very public event? Did people know this group was made up of white nationalists?
Yeah, the NRA had been founded by some Union soldiers after the Civil War, because I think it was about 20 years after the Civil War, and in 1885. These veterans felt that young men, because of the lack of war, and there are plenty of Indian wars, but they were not learning to shoot. And that same year, the sharpshooting was added to the Summer Olympics as a sport. And the United States, they felt they didn't have any candidates for including in the Olympics or sharpshooting. So that was really their initial reason for forming the National Rifle Association. And it remained a pretty benign like that, and it's kind of more elite. It was sort of like a little bit after that, Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge formed the Boone and Crockett, the Crockett and Boone Gun Club. It was sort of an elite thing. And it stayed that way. There was no legislation. They didn't talk about the Second Amendment. And so it was only, you know, with this, what I call a counter-revolution against the civil rights movement, and the, you know, the Supreme Court decision, that this was taken as a tool for well, one thing I heard one person in Oklahoma, actually a relative of mine, say is that the Second Amendment is all we have left as white people. It's all we have left. And think about that, you know, that is what, you know, the white nationalists call white genocide, that they are being the disappearance. This has been a, you know, an obsession with Western Europe and North America for a long time. It's a part of the Oriental despotism, yellow peril, fanaticism, anti-Asian bigotry, that what, you know, white people who are a tiny minority of humanity will be overwhelmed. So what do? They try to control everyone else. So that, I think, is the Harlan Carter is a very important character because he almost single-handedly transformed the NRA into a white nationalist organization. He was president in the 1960s while he was still a border guard. And then he retired as a border guard. He went up to Eastern Washington, where white nationalists had begun to congregate. They almost dominate Eastern Washington and Western Idaho now. That's what, you know, at least some of them call they want to separate as a white nation, a white nationalist nation. With only white people there. There aren't that many. I mean, there, of course, there are Native people there. Nez Perce and all have to, and the Northern Piutes had to put up with these people. But that, you know, that he almost single-handedly then formed the Second Amendment Foundation, and he organized other people, and they became activists within this kind of sleepy organization. And they took over in the election. It's a nonprofit corporation, the NRA, and they have, you know, boards of directors and the things you have to be a nonprofit. And they took over. They took over the entire leadership and turned it into, you know, very quickly. They started recruiting members. Now, there are longtime members of the NRA who people join it for different things, for different reasons. Some to get discounts on things, and some to just because they're, you know, sport. There's a whole sports hunting aspect to it, but they, I think, you know, what they should do now, I mean, I get criticized for criticizing the NRA because there are good people in the NRA, good and bad people. And I say, you know what? The good people should leave that organization and start another one if they want, because they are in a white nationalist organization, whether they like it or not. That's what it is. And, you know, you can document that. That's what it is. It's not just an opinion.
Great, thank you, fantastic. And that pretty much brings us to the end of today's event. So again, on behalf of the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center here at Virginia Tech and the Department of History at Virginia Tech, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortíz, for joining us today with this fantastic conversation. And I'd like to thank also everybody here viewing, and those of you that are going to be viewing the recording, thank you for watching. So yeah, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.